Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Singh. I'm the managing director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I'm joined here by my colleagues to talk about the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, the U.S. and Israeli attack on Iran and Iran's retaliation, which has played out across the Middle East. It's the largest conflict we've seen in the Middle East for years and the largest joint operation that the U.S. and Israel have undertaken together, arguably ever. We're going to dive right into a discussion of the issues. And I want to introduce first my colleagues who are joining me. To my immediate left here is Robert Satloff, Dr. Robert Satloff, the Segal Executive Director of the Washington Institute. To his left is our research director, Dana Stroul. And Dana is the Michael and Shelley Casson Senior Fellow here at the Washington Institute. To her left is Dennis Ross. Dennis is the Institute's Davidson Distinguished Fellow, with a long record of service in government. And then to his left is Holly Dagres, who is the Libitzky Family Fellow here at the Washington Institute as well. So my colleagues are going to start with some opening comments, and I'm going to pass it over right now to Rob Satloff. Rob.
So thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for all my colleagues for joining. I just want to underscore first what Mike mentioned at the beginning. There are a couple of very historic moments that we've already seen in this conflict, which is only 48 hours or so old. As Mike said, this is the most significant U.S. military operation in the Middle East since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. It's the most significant example of the U.S. and Israel working together in history. It is the first time that many of the countries in the Middle East are taking missile fire. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And we have already seen for the first time in American history, the United States undertaking a military initiative in which the top political leader of our adversary has been killed. And this, of course, is the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. Whether the bomb that killed him was an Israeli bomb or an American bomb doesn't really make a difference. It just does suggest that we have entered a new world in terms of that Rubicon being crossed. Let's remember, of course, that Donald Trump was himself the target of an Iranian assassination attempt earlier in his first term. A few other just contextual remarks for what I'd like to contribute in this opening round. There's a lot of talk about what are the objectives of this conflict, and my colleague Dennis is going to go into this in some detail. All I want to say at this point is that President Trump has defined objectives across the array of possibilities, from narrow to broad. There's really a Chinese menu of objectives from which he can choose at the right time, at the right moment, to say that this war has come to an end. This gives him the opportunity to define the end of the war as victory, depending on which objective he chooses. From the narrow objective of degrading, destroying the remnants of Iran's nuclear program, all the way to the broader objective of regime change, which he has identified on more than one occasion. Second observation, if Donald Trump surprised me by going big right from the outset, Iran surprised me by a strategy of internationalizing the conflict right from the outset. Let's remember that Iran began this conflict already as what I would call the loneliest regime in the world. It has no real allies in an operational sense, allies that are willing to assist it with arms, materiel, more than words. The Russians and the Chinese are not promising operational assistance to Iran. And then Iran took that loneliness and made it worse by internationalizing the conflict, hitting up and down the Gulf, hitting every Gulf state, hitting beyond the Gulf, targeting French targets in the Gulf, targeting Jordan. Now we have a situation where countries that were staying out or perhaps critical even of what the United States might have been doing now are lining up either to provide verbal support or, in some cases, practical support. The Iranians, I would have thought, would have learned the lesson from the last summer's 12-day war, that their objective would have been massive barrages of missiles against Israel to overwhelm Israel's defense capabilities. But instead, the Iranians chose a different path to spread their missile array around Arab countries, and which has had some impact, but not catastrophic impact any place. And the result has been instead to firm up an alliance against Iran. Whoever is coming up with Iran's strategy, they're keeping the wisdom of this very quiet. If Iran has had its own death wish, Iran leaders, they've certainly compelled Hezbollah to join them in this death wish. Always a question of what the proxies are going to do. The proxies stayed out of the conflict at the beginning, but we saw just last night Hezbollah decided to jump in with rockets directed toward Haifa, and Israel has responded. This is a second significant front. The Israelis were prepared. The Israelis seem to have had already enhanced their northern border, brought up reserves, were ready for Hezbollah's possible attack. And we have seen the Israelis hit across not just southern Lebanon, but into Dahia, right out the Beirut suburbs. The Lebanese government has already taken important statements, something that we shouldn't overlook. They're even asking for renewed peace negotiations, or at least renewed negotiations with Israel. None of that should obscure the fact that the real proof of the pudding in Lebanon will be whether the Lebanese armed forces finally acts with determination and effectiveness against Hezbollah. None of that no diplomacy can substitute for action by the LAF. There are a lot of reports that those missiles in Lebanon did come from the zone south of the Litani that the LAF had already promised was clear of Hezbollah weapons. So they are very much in the hot seat right now. Look, two final comments in this just opening set of remarks. One, lots of discussion about how this war is going to end. It's the traditional American question, and it's the appropriate question. It connects ends to means. We're going to go into this in some detail. I will only point out that President Trump has, both in his opening remark on Saturday and in his Truth Social 6-minute video yesterday, gone at some great length to highlight the notion that the Iranian people, as a result of what we will have done in Iran, that the Iranian people will have the opportunity to rise up and take back their country. What he doesn't say, and I'm very interested in my colleague Holly Dagres' remarks, what he doesn't say is that we will be with them every step of the way. And so this, to me, conjures up the quandary that George Herbert Walker Bush faced 35 years ago this month, when after he called on the Iraqi people to rise up and take back their country from Saddam Hussein, they listened to him. And there was a rebellion in southern Iraq and northern Iraq. They were waiting for the American cavalry to come. They never came. And they were mowed down by Saddam's helicopter battleships. That decision, do we help the Iranians through the end? I think that could be a very critical decision that we face when we make the decision about war's end. And then just lastly, between the United States and Israel, how wars end will be an American decision. And when Donald Trump says it's over, Israel's prime minister will salute, and it will be over for Israel too. But I will say, depending on how that occurs and whether or not there has been some debacle, hopefully that doesn't occur between now and then, look out for an early election in Israel. It would not at all be surprising that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to capitalize on what I think he will expect to be a rather substantial victory in at least degrading Iran, if not bringing about substantial change in Iran's regime, to capitalize on that in a new Israeli election. But we'll have a lot of time to address that between now and then.
Thanks a lot, Rob. We're going to turn now to my colleague, Dana Stroul, who, in addition to being our research director and the Casson Senior Fellow, served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East at the outset of this period of war in the Middle East, of which this is the latest chapter. Dana?
Well, thanks so much, Mike, and pleasure to be on this panel at this moment with such outstanding and brilliant colleagues. I thought what I would do is offer some observations about the campaign we've seen to date, how this compares to how U.S. political and military leaders thought about direct U.S.-Iran conflict before, and then just offer a few observations on other elements of this campaign that I am keeping my eye on. First, I just want to acknowledge the very human moment that we are in. While I'm sure all of you tuning in, just like us, have followed the news and the images all weekend long, I think it is important to reflect on all of the families and all of the people who are very scared across the region right now, in Israel, in Iran, and especially across the Gulf and Jordan, places that are not used to having ballistic missiles, drone attacks, societies that have not been raised to think about existential threats to their existence, have not had children trained to go into bomb shelters. The psychology and emotionality of this moment, I think, is something that will stay with the region long after this war is over, and is certainly shaping how leaders in the region and people are thinking about who are their friends and who are their enemies at this moment in time. And my wishes are with all of the people in the region who are suffering as a result of this. Let me just offer at first some observations on the U.S. military campaign. This is without question a combined operational effort unlike anything we have seen from the United States and Israel before. And what's very clear from the opening days is that this has been long and well planned. So the United States and Israel have had extensive operational experience in the post-October 7th Middle East. April 2024, October 2024, last summer during the 12-day war. What's clear is that the two sides have taken stock of the lessons learned, the assessments, how to actually share intelligence, how to develop targets, how to refine communication, how to do operational deconfliction, what are the strengths and the weaknesses of each military, and they have put that into a well-honed campaign, which we are seeing play out right now. Air supremacy was achieved within the first 48 hours of the campaign. We now have not only Israeli, but U.S. fighters flying above Iran with a clear division of labor in terms of targets. It is just truly remarkable from a conventional sense. And of course, I'm going to leave this to my colleague Dennis, and you heard this from Rob. The real question is not the success of the military campaign. It's what are the political end states on the other side. And those, of course, are not decisions for U.S. military or Israeli military leaders. When during my time in the Pentagon and before, when we thought about direct U.S. military Iran confrontation, there were generally concerns that I would say fall into three buckets of risk in terms of how the Iranian regime would respond. The first is that by using the military instrument directly inside Iran, Iran would activate its ballistic missile, cruise missile, and suicide drone program. And of course, we've seen the lethality of Iran's drone program in use by Russia and Ukraine. But that Iran would aim those missiles not only at Israel, not only at U.S. military bases across the Middle East, but perhaps expand the war to civilian populations in the Gulf and energy infrastructure. Secondly, there were concerns that Iran would activate its terrorist network across the Middle East. Hamas, Hezbollah, proxies in Syria and Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, etc., and that all of this network activated simultaneously would be difficult for the United States, Israel, and our partners to defend against. And finally, that military action would actually instigate Iranian political leadership to double down in their strategy, whether it was commitment to the nuclear weapons program, the missile program, or the terrorist proxy network. What is interesting about this moment in time is that the United States and Israeli military experience to date was that those worst case scenarios of Iranian retaliatory action did not come about. In the past rounds of interstate conflict we've seen, 2 in 2024, 1 in 2025, although the Iranian leadership remained committed to its strategy, nuclear weapons program, missile program, support for terrorist networks, it did not activate that whole terrorist network across the region, and it did not send ballistic missiles all across the region. It only aimed them at Israel. All of that has changed with the commencing of operations Epic Fury and Rising Lion. So this today is what military intelligence officials and policymakers in the before times worried about, that this would be the full Iranian escalation. And what is clear to me looking at this is that the Iranians are moving very, very fast in expanding the scope of their targets. In the first day, it was Israel and U.S. military installations. It quickly moved, as you heard from Rob, to civilian airports, civilian hotels, civilian centers. And as of today, it has moved to energy infrastructure and oil tankers. So we are quickly moving from beyond what could be defined as pure military targets to economic, social, and societal targets. The terms for expanding this conflict, I think, are very clear and very high risk. Secondly, I want to speak a little bit about the reaction of the region. Again, I agree completely with what Rob said. The Iranian strategy is to wear down our partners, especially in the Gulf, who need economic and social calm in order to pursue their economic and social diversification plans. Of course, war like this is not good for business. There are tourists and business people stranded all across the Middle East. But if the reaction that they were hoping for was blaming of the United States, the opposite has happened. Yesterday was a remarkable joint statement from the United States, the majority of its Arab partners in the region, condemning Iran for what it called indiscriminate attacks. Consider the Qatar Ministry of Foreign Affairs yesterday said, Iran has to pay a price for this blatant attack on our people. An attack like this cannot be left without retaliation. Extremely strong words for a country that until recently was mediating between the United States and Iran. Consider this from the European E3, Germany, France, and the UK. We will take steps to defend our interests and those of our allies in the region, potentially through enabling necessary and proportionate defensive action to destroy Iran's capability to fire missiles and drones at their source. So this means the best defense is a good offense, as in U.S. partners in Europe and in the Middle East are considering joining U.S. and Israeli efforts right now to eliminate the sources of Iranian attacks across the Middle East. It's remarkable. We already know that the UK is flying defensive missions. There were initial reports of the redirecting of a French aircraft carrier. And it is possible, again, that Gulf countries join Epic Fury in the coming days. Final comment for this initial round is the information space I find quite striking. Over the past 2 days, we've had the Iranian foreign minister on Sunday talk shows, but no Trump administration officials. There has been a drip from President Trump, but only in videos where he is speaking directly to the public, not in a briefings or question and answer. We've had members of Congress go to the Sunday talk shows and engage with the press. What President Trump has done instead is offer basically different trial balloons across different press outlets of what he might be thinking. Whether or not this disorganized and just confuses the situation or is a deliberate strategy, open question. But generally, when you're in the middle of a campaign like this, you would expect to have more clear messaging about exactly what intent is and exactly what behavior the United States would want to see in order to get to off-ramps from this military escalation. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to my colleague.
Thanks very much, Dana. We're going to turn to Dennis. Dennis is the Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Institute, as I noted. He also has advised multiple presidents, sometimes who have made correct decisions, other times who have made incorrect decisions. And so he's got experience with both sides. Dennis, take it away.
Mike, thank you. The correct decisions obviously were a function of my advice. I wish I could say that always. Look, what I want to focus on in a kind of telegraphic way is objectives and means. I write a lot about statecraft, and the key to good statecraft is you marry your objectives and means. So I'm trying to look at the Trump administration and the president and focus on what exactly are the objectives. You've heard both Rob and Dana either say this directly or allude to it. The president has been vague about the objectives. Now, one reason to be vague about objectives is it maximizes your kind of freedom of choice. It maximizes your ability to define what is success, but it also keeps a lot of people in the dark. It is striking. I also noted this yesterday, no representatives of the administration at a senior level on the talk shows, meaning it's up to everybody else to frame what we're actually trying to achieve. And maybe that gives President Trump a lot of flexibility, but it also, I think, creates a set of expectations about what's likely to emerge. What he has said so far is that we're acting in a way that will give the Iranian people a chance. When you use a kind of language that immediately leads to a conclusion, so the objective must be regime change. So let's look at this from the standpoint, if the objective is regime change, the president also seems to be taking on what has always been a conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is you cannot change the regime without boots on the ground. You cannot change regimes unless you have a significant presence on the ground. You can't change regimes only from the air. Now, it is possible that we're seeing a testing of that proposition, because if you take a look at what the U.S. and the Israelis are targeting, it isn't just the Iranian air defense and their means to carry out attacks. It is also the command control. It is also the control mechanisms that the regime has. They're going after the headquarters of the IRGC, of the besieged. They're going after the presence of the IRGC along the borders. They're going after what are the local capabilities, regional capabilities in cities and outside. It's clear there's an effort to disrupt the ability of the IRGC and the besieged, A, to respond, B, to communicate, and C, to weaken them to the point that they themselves become more vulnerable, and or you produce what amounts to serious defections. These are the key mechanisms for controlling the Iranian population. So it is possible that we are seeing an objective that is regime change. One question I would pose for this: when you pursue regime change, aside from all the uncertainties associated with it, even if you're testing the proposition the way this administration may be testing it, you raise a question about what is the end point? How will you know? It seems to me that President Trump, even though he's now talked about 4 weeks or less, when you're talking about regime change, to be able to carry out regime change in that period of time, or in the kind of period of time that I think the president has always indicated, and that those around him have said, including the vice president, this will not be a long war, you are raising basic questions about how soon you can actually bring this to a conclusion. So that raises for me what I think is maybe the real objective or a secondary objective. And I still think this may be what's defining this approach in the president's mind. I'll call it regime weakening. Weakening to the point where it becomes more vulnerable, weakening to the point where it's not capable of threatening our neighbors or their neighbors, specifically their neighbors, weakening to the point where maybe there's a decision within the regime as it exists to change course, to change path. This would be regime weakening, but it would be about changing the behavior of the regime as necessarily changing the regime itself. Venezuela might be an example of that. And what it might reflect is playing upon what are likely to be some fissures. We did see after the June war, we saw a segment of the elite, at least for a short period of time, raise basic questions about the strategy that the supreme leader had pursued. a strategy that invested heavily in a regional proxy network. And those regional proxies during the course of the 12 days were nowhere to be found. Yes, they had been weakened by the Israelis over the course of the period, the 2 years after October 7th. But the fact is, they did essentially nothing. Big investment, high cost to Iran, and no real benefit, and the likelihood that these forces were becoming weaker, not stronger. In addition, you had, by my calculation, probably over the last 30 to 40 years, about a $500 billion investment in a nuclear infrastructure within Iran. Also, dramatically weakened, maybe not obliterated, but damaged to the extent that it would take years to try to rebuild. Another example of a failed approach. And the truth is, you had voices from the elite that were basically talking about maybe that approach has failed, maybe it's time to take a different approach. Now, it is possible that in the context of a strategy or an objective of regime weakening, that we will see those groups emerge. It is interesting that President Trump said maybe we were a little bit too successful because some of those we had in mind talking to are no longer around. I'm not sure that necessarily undoes the regime weakening approach, but it also seems to me the regime weakening approach has the virtue for President Trump of, again, allowing him to define what is success. The problem with regime change is that is a kind of objective condition. If you haven't achieved it, well, then you haven't achieved what you set out to do. So regime weakening gives him much more of a capability to define what is success. Now, that he may be thinking that way, I think has been provided by the Secretary of Defense today in the statement he made to explain what's going on. I was struck in particular by his emphasis on we are not about nation building, we are not about democracy, we are about giving the Iranian people a chance, leaving it up to them to take advantage of the chance. In the meantime, we will weaken, he didn't quite put it this way, but he said, Iran will not be able to threaten. They will not be able to project power. It will not be able to threaten its neighbors. That seems to be what we are about in terms of trying to achieve. And I would add one other point that he made. He was very explicit. He said, President Trump will define when the conditions have been met or when we have achieved our objectives. Now that leaves the president, again, the enormous space to decide when this is over. By the way, it could mean that he decides to conclude this unilaterally. He can come out and he can say, we have said that the Iranians would pay a price for killing their citizens. We impose that price, and the man who ordered it, he's gone. That was one of our objectives, and we have succeeded in that. We have said they will be not able to threaten their friends or build a nuclear capability or have a nuclear weapon. They're not going to be able to pursue that. They're not going to be able to pursue a ballistic missile capability. We have succeeded in doing that. And he can define this unilaterally and then even say, I am prepared to stop the war. If the Iranians don't stop, we will hit them that much harder. So it puts it all in his hands to be able to define it. I suspect that's the way he wants to go. There is a risk. The risk could be in the aftermath of this, that the Iranians, fearing that they could lose control to a public that might be rising up, we could see a replay of what, in a sense, what Rob was talking about with President George H.W. Bush and his call to the Iraqis to rise up, and then we didn't do anything. What does President Trump do if we see a replay of what happened in early January, where anywhere from 7,100 to what may be 30 or 40,000 people were massacred? Do we do nothing in the face of that? Unless that's part of the threats that the president will make, that will also have to be something taken into consideration. Last point I will make. I think the application of force has been stunning in terms of its effectiveness. Again, Rob talked about we're only a little bit more than 2 days into this. I look at the numbers of missiles, cruise missiles, and drones that the Iranians are trying to fire. They are substantially less than would have been anticipated. I think that is less a function of intent, meaning they want to be able to preserve for a long time. I think it may be more a function of diminished capability because of the success of what we're doing. Time will tell which of those is correct. But something else that is profoundly also significant. The Iranians made this choice to isolate themselves further with the objective of, by pressuring, by attacking the Gulf states, the expectation was they have the ability to put pressure on the president to bring this to an end. So far, they don't look like they're putting that pressure on the president. We will see what happens. And very last point, I think for the president in the aftermath of this, the potential for regional integration will go up, not down. One thing that becomes clear, lessons can be learned from what's happened. Others in the region will see not only how effective we and the Israelis have been, but they will find it very much in their interest, I think, to be drawn closer to us in this regard, building more of a security relationship and a very clear reminder of who is prepared to use hard power and with some effect. Russia and China have very much sat on the sidelines. I got a question today from someone, does this make China more likely to act in Taiwan? The answer is much less likely to do so.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. Very interesting. We're going to turn now to Holly Dagres. Holly, as I mentioned, is our Libitzky Family Fellow and also one of the keenest, if not the keenest, I think, observer in Washington of the Iranian people and what's happening inside Iran. So Holly, take it away.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I figured I would lay out the mood on the ground from the start of the war, the death of the supreme leader, and where things might go. I should first begin by emphasizing what in part prompted this war to begin with, which is this unprecedented massacre, the worst in modern Iranian history, that was happened after an anti-regime uprising that was not successful in its goal in ousting the Islamic Republic. According to the group Human Rights Activists in Iran, about 7,000 were killed, and they're looking into 10,000. And we heard President Donald Trump say the numbers were in 32,000. In the lead up to this war, there were growing calls from inside Iran and in the diaspora for R2P, or responsibility to protect, a principle that the international community should intervene when crimes against humanity are being committed. Among those voicing R2P were Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi from abroad and human rights lawyer Nasrin Sotoudeh from inside the country. When the war began, I saw on social media videos of Iranians celebrating in the streets and even in schoolyards. They were dancing, they were singing patriotic songs. I saw these young Gen Z schoolboys with in English saying, "I love Trump." And, you know, this might be strange for outsiders that are looking at this and what's happening in the country, but to see that Iranians are celebrating being bombed, but it really is an attestament to their pain and suffering and just how desperate many Iranians have become for change. And so the internet was, of course, quickly shut down. And many of the videos we've been seeing come out of Iran in recent days is through Starlink. There's about 50 to 60,000 terminal users. And by the evening that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed, Iranians had taken to the streets in numerous cities to celebrate his death. There were tears of joy, dancing, honking, all despite knowing they could be arrested, which has happened, or I've been told anecdotally. There were also reports of security forces firing at those that were celebrating. We saw regime supporters come out in massive numbers on March 1st, but I think that it's important to note these are supporters of the regime, so they don't have to fear repression hanging over their heads as they're part of the status quo. So just imagine that these people that had gone out and celebrated, it was an act of bravery in this moment. Mehdi Mahmoodian, a political dissident that was recently released from prison and is actually the co-writer of the Oscar-nominated foreign film, It Was Just an Accident. And I should probably explain what this film is, and I recommend watching it. It's a microcosm of Iranian society and how the Iranian people would react to the regime after the fall of the Islamic Republic. Would they kill their repressors or would they put them on trial? And so that should give you a little bit of a sense of the mood of why Iranians reacted the way they did to Khamenei's death. I want to emphasize on what he said in an interview in the New Yorker just the past day or so. He explicitly said that he was anti-war, but he had, quote, I hope the Islamic Republic reaches its end. Otherwise, even harsher days could lie ahead for prisoners. And he was there referring to political prisoners who are languishing in prison during wartime. Many activists and rights organizations are concerned about their safety and have been calling for their release. I should note at the end of the 1988 Iran and Iraq War, there were 5,000 political prisoners executed by the regime. And we're also, I should also note that, during the last year alone, there were over 20,000 arrests, and 2025 became the highest year of executions since the 1980s with 2,105 executions. So if this regime is to survive, it would carry out mass executions. And already before this war had begun, they were on track to beat the 2025 execution numbers with at least 552 executions carried out, including 246 in February. I also think it's important to emphasize that as with the 12-day war, there are no air raid sirens, there are no shelters for Iranians to run to. Those that have been able to afford to have fled the capital, Tehran. So and given that this is a war, there are and will be human casualties, or civilian casualties, excuse me. There were at least 333 reported on February 28th, according to the human rights activists in Iran. There were more than 100 children, according to Iranian officials and teachers inside the country, that were killed at a school in the south. So I would say that no Iranian wants to see bloodshed and that their country to be destroyed. So as this war continues, I think that the mood we've been seeing, at least initially, could change over time.
Great. Thanks very much, Holly. I want to ask a few questions of our blockbuster panel here. And of course, I would encourage everyone who's watching to also submit your own questions for this event. You can do that by sort of sending us a question through social media. You can also send us a question via email. Let me just start by asking this question about objectives and what are we trying to accomplish here? A lot has been written about this today, and President Trump actually spoke about this today. He outlined actually 4 objectives: nuclear, missiles, sinking Iran's navy, which was not really part of the conversation prior to this conflict. I don't think many had identified it as an imminent threat to the United States. And then he also talked, what was the 4th objective? I'm forgetting actually right now. There was nuclear, missiles, navy, and proxies. I'm sorry. Eliminating Iran's ability to support its proxies. He didn't mention regime change. So I'm curious, and let me start with Dennis. What we're doing now, which of those 4 objectives, how many of those 4 objectives are we likely to accomplish with what we're doing now?
I think we're likely to accomplish a lot of them. The question is, does the president have a clear criteria of what constitutes success in each of them? I mean, with the nuclear at this point, we're basically hitting what's already been hit, unless you're going after all the engineers and the physicists in Iran. I'm not sure what more you can actually do on the nuclear issue. On ballistic missiles, we're clearly, along with the Israelis, we're going after not just the depots, not just the, where there might be stockpiles, but we're going after the whole industrial base that is connected to producing them. So it really is an infrastructure that's pretty widespread, but also something that is targetable. And I think between the two of us, given the scope of the array, and we're talking about 400 aircraft operating over Iranian airspace with an impunity, hitting at this point probably as much as 1,500 different targets. But clearly, this is one of the major ones. So in the area of ballistic missiles, I think there will be we will set them back for years. And if you think about it, even if they wanted to rebuild them, it means that those resources are not going to a public that is already profoundly alienated. I think in terms of proxies, I think there's probably an internal debate within Iran already. We saw, that's what I was referring to, the post-June period. Those say, gee, that 40 billion we spent on Assad, that was really well spent, wasn't it? And Hezbollah, which basically did nothing in June, and today, they fired a very small number of missiles, and Israel is now responding in a way that may well render Hezbollah no longer even a significant political actor in Lebanon. I think the proxies, that also is likely to be successful. The one area where there really wasn't much said, it wasn't regime change per se, but it is where he started, and Hegseth repeated that issue twice on the issue of giving the public a chance. Here, I think my question will be, what are we actually prepared to do if this regime sees itself immediately threatened by demonstrations and they start to do a significant crackdown? Again, what are we prepared to do in that circumstance? Even if the president at that point doesn't necessarily focus on that, other than to say, we're prepared to act again if we see you act against your citizens, the problem for him in that circumstance is he won't have an end to the war. He'll have to resume it. And then he moves back much more into what I would call the regime change moment. Again, the reason I don't think regime change is on his agenda is because he doesn't have an easy endpoint, if that's the case. But on the other objectives, I think he's already in a position to claim success.
Other views? The president also said, I should say, before you give your answer, Rob, that this was his last best chance to intervene. So in addition to, are we going to accomplish these objectives? Was it imminent? Was this our last best chance?
What I wanted to note is there was a line that one uses to understand Trump, which became famous in the first term, which is you take him seriously, but not literally. Namely, you don't focus on the specifics of what he says, but you take the gestalt of where he's going. I think now in the second term, or at least in the Iran conflict, we have to have an amendment to this, which is you don't take any particular statement. You take any particular statement seriously, but not literally, because there have now been three major statements: Saturday morning, yesterday, 6 minutes, and again today. They were all significant. They weren't off the cuff. They were all well prepared. They were all speeches that he delivered, and they were different. So which one is the determinative one? I mean, your guess is as good as the leaders of Iran, Israel, and the Middle East. We don't know, but he has the option to choose. That, I think, is the big takeaway. Was it the last best chance to act? We don't know. I think, in retrospect, clearly Donald Trump was, in some sense, boxed in by his commitment to the Iranian people that started this entire precipice toward war, which is, we'll be there for you. And then we went off on this sideways trek into nuclear negotiations, and now we're back into this, A to Z spectrum of potential objectives, not just nuclear, but the Navy, the proxies, etc. Was it the last best chance? It'll be some time until after this conflict before we can make that judgment.
I'll just add here that I think he did not just box himself in by expressing solidarity with the Iranian people. He boxed himself in with the rapid increase of U.S. military posture in the Middle East. And the challenge there, if you compare to last summer, is there was a 12-day war that significantly degraded the missile program and the nuclear program, and that built on 2+ years after October 7th of degrading the proxy network. But what was clear after last summer with the ambiguous ceasefire that was imposed by President Trump himself is that the strategy and the commitment of the Iranian regime to the same destabilizing strategy approach, nuclear weapons, missiles, then nuclear weapons, and working to reconstitute the terror network, was unchanged. And even worse, it was after its degradation abroad and its failure to be able to deliver for the Iranian people at home, that it committed that massacre against the people of Iran. So all of that combined, plus the military posture, I think President Trump was looking at and saying, well, the regime did not change its behavior after all of this kinetic action against it. So now I need to change the regime in order to get this behavior to stop. And I think that is the trap he's built for himself now, because he cannot afford the U.S. military, the United States taxpayer, the people of the United States cannot afford to build this kind of rapid military posture every year when the Iranian regime does things to significantly destabilize the region.
Well, it's a great segue to my next set of questions, because I do want to ask about regime change. It's something that didn't appear in that list of 4 objectives that President Trump gave. It's something that Secretary Hegseth in his press conference explicitly said is not our objective. But if you listen to Hegseth, he also said, well, this isn't a regime change war, but boy, has the regime changed, I think is what he said. And so maybe, Holly, I'll start with you on this. The death of Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, only the second leader that the Islamic Republic has had since 1979. Is this, in a sense, already regime change? You know, how profoundly is Khamenei's death, even without a democratic uprising or something like that, going to change Iran?
First, I should start by saying that, you know, in Washington, there was always speculation about when Khamenei dies, what the Islamic Republic would look like. But just like when the Sultan of Oman passed away, it was very much streamlined. And from what we're seeing so far, it is being streamlined per the Iranian constitution. So Article 111 of the Iranian constitution stipulates that a 3-member council would take over his duties, and that is President Masoud Pezeshkian, Gholam Mohsen Ejai, the judiciary chief, and Ali Reza Arafi of the Guardian Council. And that's exactly what's happened. We've heard from the Iranian foreign minister that there may be a succession in the coming days. And what that would look like is that the 88-member of Assembly of Experts that are elected by the Iranian people every 8 years would then decide. There have been numerous names floating around. And so to me, when we talk about regime change, and I think Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said this, he said, this is not regime change, but it has been a change of the regime. So the face of the regime is still very much there at this present moment and is gone, but it's getting changed in the coming days potentially. And I think I should note that what also really stood out to me was that because this is wartime, these 88 elderly members or clerics, they're actually going to not be meeting in person. They're actually going to be meeting potentially on Zoom, and there is a domestic internet in the country. And so I think that is noteworthy. And they do function like the College of Cardinals. There will be a lot of horse trading that happens. But at this juncture, unless Israel and the United States decide to take on more or cut off more of the clerical establishment, it's still a functioning government.
And how likely do you think, Holly? I mean, so we have that succession process playing out. At the same time, we have the United States and Israel trying to create the conditions, as we've said, at least, for the Iranian people to rise up and take the reins of government. Is that likely to happen? How likely is it that we would see the Iranian people rising up and seizing government for themselves? And is there something that we could do or something that we might do that would make that more or less likely?
Well, I think there's definitely a want for a regime change amongst much of the Iranian people. That's why they've had these cyclical anti-regime protests for years. That being said, at this juncture, we really haven't seen the clerical establishment be eroded down, especially the security apparatus that would actually be using bullets and batons against the Iranian people to crush any sort of uprising. And I think the important thing, the element we're all looking at right now is defections. And if I'm not mistaken, during President Donald Trump's remarks yesterday, he had basically threatened security forces that they should defect or else they would face certain death. So at this juncture, we haven't seen what that looks like. It means many things. It doesn't mean just actually laying down your arms and declaring that you're going to side with the people. It can mean feigning illness, not showing up to work. And we really haven't gotten any measurement of that. But this is day 3 of this war. So over time, that could obviously change. And I think it's just really too soon to tell. But I think as long as the security apparatus is still able to crush protesters like we've been seeing after Khamenei's death, I think you're not going to see much movement just yet, but that can change.
I want to shift a little bit to talking about the sort of regional effects of the war. I mean, Rob talked a lot about the likely campaign we're about to see in Lebanon. We've also touched upon the effect that the war has now had on Gulf states. Almost all of the Gulf states, plus other states like Jordan, Cyprus as well, have been affected by this. Some have suffered deaths and significant damage. We saw this statement that I think Dana alluded to from the GCC, which almost seemed to threaten that they might become involved in the war. And so I'm curious, and maybe this goes first to you, Dana. You were one of the architects of this sort of system, this regional system that we have in place in the Middle East. And I'm wondering if now that you're seeing it in operation, in a sense, certainly not for the first time, but for the first time at this scale, how is it operating? Do you think that in the Pentagon they're satisfied with how our regional partners have responded? And then second, for the larger group, do we think that our Gulf partners have the capacity and the will to actually participate in strikes on Iran? And I'm especially curious, and Rob and Dennis, if you have a view on this, does the fact that Israel is involved, is that a major obstacle to them doing so?
So to your first question, Mike, I certainly contributed, but I really do want to give credit to the uniformed military leadership of U.S. Central Command, the operational military headquarters of the United States Department of War, who has oversight over all U.S. military operations and security cooperation in the Middle East, because they are the ones that actually worked on the connective tissue and did both the technical and the operational and the political investment and building of trust to create the system that we've now seen proof of concept. When our partners work together with the United States, lives can be saved. And looking at just the first couple of days, it's frankly remarkable. Our partners have invested in U.S. air defense systems. They have sent their officers to professional military education in the United States and our war colleges. They have participated in U.S. security cooperation seminars. They have actively worked with our U.S. CENTCOM trainers in CENTCOM conferences with our defense attaches. And because they are willing to share and work with the United States, especially in our hubs like the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid in Qatar, they are both receiving intelligence in real time from the United States, and the United States is the hub that's taking in feeds and information from all of our partners, integrating it and getting it to our partners, and then shooting it out in real time so that our partners can use their U.S. origin systems to defend themselves. And this is day 3. These partners have intercepted hundreds of ballistic missiles, hundreds of attack drones. So this to me is proof of concept that its work is working. And despite a lot of public disputes and tensions, either with the United States, at Israel, within the Gulf Cooperation Council, I think it's quite clear that when it comes to military and intelligence cooperation, this was always happening under the surface the whole time, because this enables these militaries to save lives. And not to get out in front of my colleagues here, but I do want to say our partners have operated in coalitions with us in the past, and they certainly can do so again. They have the operational capability. This is a political decision. They did it in the Defeat ISIS operation. They've done it in other coalitions, and they can do it again if their political leadership is ready to do it.
So let me pick up on that point. I think one of the things I've been struck by is actually how effective the defense has been. I've heard from the Emirates that they have intercepted 92% of what's been launched against them. Still a very small area, really high value targets, so that it comes with some real cost to them. But also there's been a kind of stoicism that one might not have predicted in advance, but has been there. So that's point 1. Point 2, yes, they have participated with us in the past. I think it's harder for them to engage in this except symbolically. Defense, yes. Offense, much more difficult. What has been carried out by us with the Israelis has been so thoroughly prepared, and we don't have that kind of an experience offensively with our partners in the area, certainly as it would relate to what you would do against an array of Iranian targets right now. But in answer to your question, Mike, about because Israel's involved, would they be involved? They will justify their involvement, and they won't talk about Israel. They'll talk about the fact they were attacked. And whatever they're doing, they're responding to the fact that they were attacked. This was their territory. And that's why I say I can see them doing something symbolically. And I think the presence of Israel in this, I don't think that will affect that.
So I just have to add here because I think my colleague and I respectfully disagree. I think our partners, it is a political decision. They can absolutely do something offensive. First of all, the difference in the past couple of days is we've heard our partners move from defining what we might say is defensive to offensive. Because they are on the receiving end of these ballistic missiles, they are incentivized to actually go to the source, to the target. There's air supremacy over Iran. The United States and Israel are flying. We can certainly facilitate identifying targets for our partner air forces in the region. It's a political decision.
So Rob, I know you have something to say about this. You had mentioned 1991 and the Gulf War, when we asked Israel explicitly not to get involved. And now here we are operating with Israel in a massive campaign and potentially, these regional partners getting involved in something that Israel started. So I'm just curious as to your perspective.
So look, two comments. First of all, I think we should all thank the Iranians for bringing an end to the Saudi-Emirati feud, which now seems like ancient history, that the Saudis and Emiratis are on the same side. If you look at the Saudi statement on Saturday about joining with their sisterly countries to condemn what the Iranians were doing, the Emirates were listed first among equals. I think that was a subliminal message that, at least for now, first things first, we have a common enemy. Second, just to put this very interesting debate in a little bit of cinematic perspective, one of my favorite movies is Independence Day. If you remember in Independence Day, the old one, the original one, not the. If you remember the original Independence Day, at the end of the movie, where all the peoples of the world were coming together to fight the alien, there was a scene of Arabs and Israeli air forces working cooperatively. Now, at the time, it was meant to underscore that it would take an alien to bring Arabs and Israelis together. That's what the politics was in 1990 when the first movie came out. We're now 35 years later, and we're having a reasonable, intelligent conversation about whether the Arabs and Israelis are going to fight side by side. It took the Iranians, not an alien, to make that happen. That's where we are today, that the Iranians are today the common enemy of everybody. The Europeans, the Arabs, the Israelis. Success for the Iranians to create themselves as the common enemy that brings us to debate whether even the Arabs and Israelis will fly airplanes together to bomb them. That's where we are today.
One of several ways it feels like we're living amid science fiction right now. But
yes.
I want to ask another question about the military side of things, and I have actually Dana and Holly especially in mind with this one, and it's about the boots on the ground question, because President Trump said today something which will be headline grabbing, which is that he doesn't rule out boots on the ground in Iran. So I'm just curious. So Dana, you've had to engage in the military planning process. What does that look like? And Holly, for you, when Iranians hear that, is that something that, is going to trigger a sort of nationalistic rally around the flag type of effect? Do Iranians hear that and they think liberation is coming, or would we expect something different inside Iran?
I think that's a really complex question. I think I could have given you a much more straightforward answer years ago that it would have evoked a nationalistic response. But given the unprecedented massacre, I think that it's a mixed bag. But I think more likely than not, especially if this drags on, I could see a negative response from the Iranian people, because war means civilian casualties. And I think that Iranians, like people everywhere, have moods that change quickly when events happen quickly. And so I just don't see that in the long term they would be okay with that.
Dana?
And then in terms of what this looks like, it looks like whatever the objectives are that the US president sets out for those ground forces. I would say, first of all, Iran is much larger population than a place where the United States has deployed massive ground forces in the past. It is geographically diverse. It's ethnically diverse. U.S. military without a civilian partner on the ground to accomplish what mission exactly, I think is the fundamental challenge of saying he doesn't rule ground forces out. The question is to do what? Generally, a U.S. military heavy mission, nation building, trying to teach a civilian population about restoring basic services, anti-corruption, democracy, inclusive governance has not bode very well for the United States or for the countries that we purport to be attempting to help and stabilize. So without a very well-defined mission, timeline, conditions, expectations, funding an international coalition, I think it's a very fraught proposition.
Got it. Well, we have just about 10 minutes left in our program. And before we go to sort of final thoughts, one more issue I want to touch on, because I think it'll become a very salient issue this week in Washington. And Dana, I'm going to ask you about this again, but I welcome others' views as well. Whenever we have a conflict in any part of the world, but it especially comes up frequently in the Middle East, there is this question about congressional authorization, the role that others in government play, and so forth. This is likely to play out as Congress returns this week. And so what should everyone think about this? Does the Trump administration require authorization to do what it's doing? What role can Congress play in this type of conflict, if any?
Well, first of all, the time for Congress to have a role would have been before the war was initiated. Generally, for a president to execute a mission like this, he and one day she would need to make clear that there was an imminent threat facing the United States. And so the president was authorized under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution to take force without coming to Congress to seek an authorization for the use of military force. And we've heard members of Congress on both sides of the aisle ask for more fulsome briefings from the Trump administration about what the immediate and imminent threat was that provided him the justification to do this military buildup and initiate this campaign absent coming to Congress first. In all likelihood, there will be, at least in the House of Representatives, a war powers resolution vote as early as tomorrow. Regardless of whether or not that vote passes, it will have no immediate effect on the conduct of this war. And in the future, yes, Congress will have a say. At some point, a bill will come due for this military campaign. It will be in salaries, overtime, and high risk to the U.S. service members who have been put in harm's way. It will be in rebuilding our munitions and missile interceptor stockpiles. It will be the wear and tear on this massive military buildup across the Middle East. And then, because of all of the munitions and missile interceptors and other equipment that our partners are using, all of which they purchase from U.S. defense industry will also have to rise to the occasion to replenish all of our partners across the Middle East. And there already was strain on the defense industrial base here in the United States. All of this has financial implications and dollar figures attached. And that debate, I think, will be quite shocking to the American people when they learn what the true cost of this is.
And Dennis, let me ask you as well, just for your thoughts on this, because I know you've had, I'm sure, to go up to the Hill many times to explain policies and actions to folks up there. I mean, how important is it for the success of this campaign that Congress be on board, that Congress be involved? And is it connected at all to the low levels of public support that we're seeing for the campaign?
Yes, I have had to do this in the past. And I can say it was never, even at a time when you had centrists dominating, a much bigger centrist coalition of Republicans and Democrats, it was never a simple sell. What's interesting to me right now, we have a reality where Republicans, for the most part, are quite loyal to the president and don't defect from him. But in the House of Representatives, we've also seen there's a small body of those who are more identified with the MAGA movement, who are not enthusiastic about this. The fact that the president went ahead and said, he doesn't rule out boots on the ground, that's much more likely to produce some Republicans defecting from him. I mean, the last part of your question, Mike, is a really important one, because you also think about what are the signals that are sent to your adversary when you go for something like this, and then you begin to lose domestic support. Now, I think in the current circumstance, the Iranians are so isolated, and I think facing such profound challenges from within, maybe they won't pick up so much what's emerging on the Hill right now. But if over time this were to last and it would look like the president wasn't maintaining support, there would be an impulse on their part, if they could, to try to last longer and put him in a position where he's the one who has to seek an end to the war. So their narrative, which after the June war was, we didn't seek an end to the war. It was Trump who had to intervene on behalf of the Israelis. It will be interesting to see whether that's a position they will try to adopt. I'm a little bit more dubious of that, just because I think they're dramatically weaker right now.
Got it.
Not to comment on the war powers issue, but more broadly, I mean, things are moving at such, to continue the science fiction metaphor, at warp speed here. If we remember, it was less than a week ago that Donald Trump delivered the State of the Union address, which was all about the American economy and about how gas prices in some parts of the economy, in some parts of the country, are under $2 a gallon. Now, after this week, those under $2 a gallon prices are going to be over $2 a gallon. Clearly, Donald Trump has an interest in bringing whatever is happening in Iran to an end swiftly, so that he can focus on, in whatever way he thinks fit, focus on the midterm elections, touting the success of the American economy. So I think we should, I mean, there is certainly a political context, no matter what. And so trying to contain what is happening in the Gulf will surely be a major issue for people that are voting on the War Powers Resolution, but more importantly, a major issue for debates in the White House about, where this goes next, boots on the ground, how this war ends.
Well, I can tell you're an experienced moderator, Rob, because that's a great segue to really our final question, which is to get all of your concluding thoughts. And I'm very curious about, what are you watching? What's coming next? What do you think is coming next? And if you want to venture a guess, how long is this going to last? And I'm going to start with Dana and then go to Holly and then Dennis and Rob.
I am not going to venture a guess, but I will share a few of the indicators I'm watching over the coming days that I think will influence the level of broad American support, hear reactions of members of U.S. Congress, and also most likely President Trump's thinking about how long this lasts, because he's the only person that knows. First of all, it's casualties. In the past 24 hours, we've had the first 3 U.S. casualties. And there have been, apparently as of this morning, the loss of a few U.S. fighter aircraft. President Trump did say early on Saturday morning that there were going to be U.S. casualties, insinuating or suggesting or confirming that he understood and was briefed that this was a high-risk campaign in which there would be the deaths of U.S. service members. Angry U.S. families who cannot articulate the reasons why their loved ones made the ultimate sacrifice are quite animating here domestically, especially in a midterm election cycle. So I'm looking at U.S. casualties. Secondly, while right now our Gulf countries, Jordan and others, are displaying impressive air defense against Iranian assaults, there's no question that the civilian populations and societies are traumatized, and unlike Israel, do not have bomb shelters and work with society's children to build resilience. And so whether or not this over time begins to put Arab leaders in a difficult place with respect to their societies is something I'm watching. 3 is markets. Of course, the price of oil was already up this morning, more intense for Europe than the United States. This is likely to only get worse over time, especially as shipping through the Strait of Hormuz closes. And finally, munitions and missile interceptor stocks. At this moment in time, of course, U.S. Provided air defense and U.S. air defense is working very well, also Israeli air defense. But there's a limited stock of missile interceptors. The Iranians also have a limited stock of missiles to terrorize the region. And so the arithmetic of who speeds up, who slows down, and what those stockpiles look like will certainly determine decisions of the political leadership on all sides.
Thanks a lot, Dana. Holly?
I'm just gonna add a little bit to what Dana said. I definitely agree that it's really a hard thing to gauge how long this will last. It could be anything from days to weeks. And I think those indicators on the outside are key. I also, as an Iran analyst, I'd like be focusing more on the indicators inside the country and what it means for Iran as a whole is who they hit inside the leadership. Do they continue to target upper echelons of the clerical establishment? I also am curious to see if there are defections. Actually, during the January uprising, there were reportedly 2 Iranian diplomats, one in Austria and one in Switzerland, I believe, that defected. So we might see defections of Iranian officials outside the country, inside, and then maybe the security forces or even a possible leadership fleeing the country. So that's another point to watch. And of course, I think what can also be an important indicator inside the country is shortages of food, fuel, and basic goods. And that could definitely impact the mood on the ground as well. So those are some of the initial things I would be focusing on.
Thanks a lot, Holly. Dennis, what are you watching?
3 things, one of which is what the last point that Holly raised. I will be really interested to see if we see any signs of defections within the IRGC or the besieged. And when I refer to defections, I also mean, in a sense, you referred to this before, people just not showing up. So that I think will be worth watching, number one. Number two, I'm really focused on this issue of how much the Iranians are able to continue to do. If this is a strategy where they want to play for time, it's one thing, but I wonder how much there's a use or lose reality for them. And I suspect there may be more of that than they certainly want to let on. And the third thing will be related to something you said about pressures that might come from the Gulf states. The more there is interest in finding a way to end this, the more I suspect we may see a new mediator emerge. And who could that be? It could be Putin, because Putin would want to save the Iranians to the extent he can, look relevant at the same time, and come in with Trump and be able to say, look, I can give you an exit strategy. I'm your pal after all. So I will be watching for that, those 3.
Got it. And Rob, last word goes to you.
So it's clear so far that if President Trump had in mind a Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela outcome in Iran, that's not in the offing. He's made one of his comments over the weekend that he had 3 people in mind for potentially taking over with whom he could do a deal, but they're all dead. And now he doesn't really have that person. Maybe one will emerge. When I look down the road at sort of how this ends, one of the key factors will be if somebody emerges that offers him that. I mean, it's too cute to say that Delcy Rodriguez type option, but without that option, then we're in for a longer haul, something which is totally terra incognita in this administration, where President Trump seems to like brief uses of military power, one day in Iran, one day in Venezuela. So this is a whole new experience. My guess is that the first real opportunity that he can bring it to an end and call victory with a partner or with some defined, visible sense of victory is what he will likely to take.
Well, thanks very much, Rob. Well, we don't know how long this is going to last, but we know it'll have reverberations for years in the Middle East and the world. And so please continue to follow the work of my colleagues here, my colleagues at the Washington Institute, on our website, washingtoninstitute.org, on X, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on other social media. And thanks for joining us today.